Lavallee. I'm an artist making my own special kind of art. And right here is the source of my art material. Most people would call this junk mail, but to me it isn't junk because from it I can make my own recycled handmade paper. Here are some of the examples of my work. First, here is a typical example of my work, which shows the texture of the paper. For this piece, I first pressed the design into the paper, then worked into it with some pastels and watercolor paints. This is a piece where I pressed a geometric design into the paper. I also used colored pencils and a felt tip marker. Here you can also see that the paper is rather strong and flexible. Liquid paint was added to the wet pulp for this piece. This is another example which shows a watercolor transfer which was pressed onto the paper. And this is an intaglio print. Here's another good example showing the texture of the paper. I used watercolor paints and inks as the paper was drying. And this is a portrait of a friend of mine done with black marker. With time, I've worked out my own techniques to recycle paper. Here is some of the equipment that I use. I have a large pot, a couple of dish pans, an old stick, a small plastic container, a fry pan, and I have also made my own decal and mold. The mold can be made from an old frame with silk, nylon, or rayon type material stretched over it, and then it is attached with tacks around the edges. The decal is a removable piece that fits on top of the screen. For this, you can use another old frame and just attach it to the mold with a couple of rubber bands. Usually I try to use things that I already have rather than buying some special supplies. I also use 6 blankets which are cut to the same size as the decal. They can be anything that is thick and absorbent. I have 2 boards which are also cut to the same size as the decal, and they are used to form the press. 3/4 inch particle board works well because it will not warp. I also use 4 clamps and a sponge. To get started, I first take some mail and rip it into small pieces and then drop it into a bag. The paper should be torn rather than cut, chopped, or shredded by a machine. A machine would shorten the fibers and they wouldn't be able to bind together as well to form the sheet of paper. When I have torn up enough paper, I then put the bits into the cooking pot along with just enough water to cover the paper. Then I cook this for at least 2 to 3 hours at a very low heat. Occasionally, I mix it with a stick and I add more water whenever it is needed. Also, it is important to remember to use a non-aluminum pot to cook in. This is so that the paper will not be discolored by the chemical breakdown of the metal. The cooking helps to loosen the cellulose fibers of the paper, while it also helps to break down the inks and other chemicals so that they can be rinsed out more easily at the next step. All during the cooking, more water needs to be added, and the mixture should be stirred several times. After the paper is cooked for 2 to 3 hours, I let it cool a while, and then it is poured into a dish pan. And again, more water is added. Next, some alcohol and hydrogen peroxide are added. This is to help clean the pulp, and it also helps to keep the bacteria level down so that paper will not smell bad or turn rotten. It is best if you can do this next step at a large sink, bathtub, or even outdoors. After I let the mixture set for about a half an hour, the batch of paper is stirred again and then poured out over the decal and the mold. At this stage, the mold is just being used as a strainer for the rinsing of the pulp. This rinsing is repeated again and again by returning the pulp to the dish pan with more clean water and then again pouring it out over the decal and the mold. The pulp should be rinsed like this until the water which drains off looks clean. After rinsing, I then squeeze out some of the excess water and put a bit of the pulp into the fry pan, where it is to be mashed with the flat stick. Some people may want to use a mallet or some machine, but I've worked out this alternative and it works well for me. Using the stick, I mash the pulp while holding the pan with my feet. It is pounded and mashed like this until most of the bits of paper are broken down. Every batch of paper will be different. Once the paper pulp has been mashed, it is again rinsed using the decal and the mold as before. This helps to clean the pulp, and it also helps to make the pulp smoother and more workable. Next, I take the pulp and mix it into the dish pan with as much as 70 to 80% water. This is to allow the cellulose fibers to be more evenly distributed, and it also keeps them from clumping together. Following this, the mixture needs to be stirred for at least a couple of minutes so that the fibers are suspended well in the water. While I'm mixing, I can add flour, starch, clay, gelatin, or even glue into the pulp. This will strengthen the paper and also give it various textures. This is also a good time to get a little more creative if you'd like. You can experiment by throwing in some flower petals or dye or sawdust or anything else that you'd like to experiment with. Once everything has been added and stirred together, I then test the mixture with a bit of pH test tape. This should be available at a local chemical or scientific supply house. By dipping the tape into the pulp, I'm able to see if it has an acid content which is too high, too low, or if it's neutral. The pH level is considered neutral or balanced at 7.0. This is indicated by the color change of the test strip. If the tape shows a yellow color, that means there is too much acid in the mixture, and that it should be neutralized with a base chemical such as baking soda or a small amount of lye. If the color is more on the blue end, that means that more acid needs to be added, and a little bit of vinegar can be used to increase the acidity in that case. This is done so that the paper will not decay and become discolored or break down as quickly. The pH test should be repeated until the color indicates that you have a neutral pH balance of 7.0. And now here's the part where I actually form the sheet of paper. Some paper makers will dip the screen into a vat filled with the pulp and form the sheet by lifting the decal and the mold. Instead, I just pour the pulp onto the surface of the mold. Using the plastic container, I pour some of the mixture onto the screen. I allow it to flow across the surface. The decal, which is attached to the top of the mold, helps to keep the wet pulp from running off the edges of the screen. This also gives shape to the sheet as the excess water drains down through the screen, leaving a layer of the pulp evenly on top. Once the water has stopped draining away, I take off the rubber bands and the decal is removed. Now I have a new sheet of paper which is to be transferred from the screen to the press. This is to be done with the blankets, the particle board, and the 4 clamps. A blanket is carefully placed on top of the wet sheet of paper, and then one of the boards is placed on top of that. Next, I take hold of the entire thing and flip it over so that the screen is now on top, and then I take the sponge and rub it against the back of the screen. This pulls some of the water out of the paper, and it should also cause the paper to stick to the blanket instead of the screen. The mold is then carefully lifted away, leaving the paper on the blanket and the board. A dry blanket is then placed on top of the paper, and the other board is placed over that. Following this, the 4 clamps are fastened around the edges. As this is being done, more water is being forced out as the clamps squeeze the boards together. Avoid making the clamps too tight, because that would crush the boards and also cause the corners to crack away. Next, I carefully remove the top board while I hold the blankets and the paper to the lower board. Then I separate and carefully peel away the top blanket, making sure that the paper isn't also being pulled up. Once the wet blanket is removed, it is then replaced with a dry one. This will soak up more water and it helps the paper to dry more quickly. After replacing the board, I hold it and flip it over again. And then I separate and peel the blanket on this side, just as I did before. Then I put a dry blanket on this side and replace the board. This time when I close the press, it is no longer necessary to use the clamps because the paper has already been pressed. All that needs to be done now is just to let the paper dry. The piece of paper is kept between boards to keep it flat, and books and other weights can be put on top of the boards, but you don't need to have too much pressure while drying. One trick which I use to allow the paper to dry faster is to leave the paper open to the air for a while. It shouldn't dry for too long this way, or else it will wrinkle and curl up at the edges. To avoid this, the paper needs to be kept pressed flat for most of the drying time. The drying time will be different for each piece of paper, and it depends on a variety of things such as the size and thickness of the paper and what the weather is like on that day. On a warm, dry day, a sheet like this may dry completely in a couple of hours, but on another day, it may take 6 hours or even more. Usually I keep on checking the press and changing the blankets whenever they feel damp. It is also helpful to turn the boards of the press over so that the drier side is towards the paper. The switching of the blankets is repeated until the sheet of paper is completely dry. You will know when the paper is dry when it no longer feels cool or damp to the touch, and it remains flat without the boards. The paper is now finished, and it is ready to be worked on with ink, paint, liquid dye, food coloring, or whatever else you have. Hopefully this has given you some ideas of things you may want to try for yourself. You now have seen the basic steps of paper making, and you can do things as I have shown you, or you might just work things out for yourself. But whatever you decide to do is only limited by your imagination. So be creative, have some fun with it, and see where it takes you. Thank you for watching.